Margaret Thompson thought she had it all figured out. 30 years of saving, 30 years of trust, 30 years of believing that someone else was watching over her future. She was exactly 365 days away from freedom when her phone buzzed with an email that would rewrite everything she thought she knew about security. The subject line was simple: important update regarding your pension fund. She almost deleted it, thinking it was just another routine notice. But something made her pause. Maybe it was the way her heart skipped when she saw those words, or maybe it was the quiet voice in her head that had been whispering warnings she'd chosen to ignore. What Margaret discovered in that email wasn't just a number on a screen. It was the moment she realized that decades of blind faith had cost her everything she'd worked for, and that starting over at 59 would require a kind of courage she didn't know she possessed. At 59, Margaret Thompson had perfected the art of invisible strength. Every morning at 5:30, she'd rise in the same modest two-bedroom house she'd called home for 23 years, brew coffee in a mug that read, "World's Okayest Nurse," and prepare for another day of holding other people's lives together. The drive to St. Mary's Regional Hospital was always the same 15-minute route through neighborhoods that had watched her grow from a young nursing student into the woman everyone called when things got complicated. She knew every pothole, every traffic light, every shortcut that could save precious seconds when an ambulance call came through. In the cardiac unit, Margaret wasn't just another face in scrubs. She was the one who remembered that Mrs. Chen liked her pillows fluffed exactly twice, the one who could spot trouble in a heart monitor from across the room, the one who stayed late without complaint when families needed someone to explain what the doctors had said in language they could actually understand. But behind her steady smile and capable hands, Margaret carried a different kind of rhythm. Each paycheck brought the same quiet ritual: a glance at her account balance, a mental calculation of years remaining, a small prayer of gratitude that her early retirement dream was still on track. She'd learned to ignore the occasional balance alert from her credit union, telling herself that automatic pension contributions meant she was building something solid, something that would catch her when she was finally ready to fall. Her colleagues saw competence. Her patients saw compassion. Her neighbors saw the woman who never missed a shift, never complained about overtime, never seemed to worry about anything more complicated than whether the grocery store would have her favorite tea in stock. What they didn't see was how Margaret had spent 3 decades believing that someone else was taking care of the numbers that mattered most. How she'd trusted systems and institutions with the same faith she brought to every medical procedure, every patient interaction, every small act of care that defined her days. She was the kind of person who saved lives for a living, yet had never learned to save herself from the one thing that would matter most when the scrubs came off for the final time. Margaret's life moved in the comfortable rhythm of someone who had found her place in the world. Tuesday mornings meant fresh flowers from the farmer's market. Nothing fancy, just daisies or sunflowers that would brighten her kitchen windowsill for the week ahead. She'd arrange them while her second cup of coffee cooled, humming softly to the radio playing in the background. The hospital had become her second home in the truest sense. She knew which vending machine gave the best coffee, which elevator moved fastest during shift changes, which corner of the break room caught the afternoon sun just right for reading. Her locker held the same reliable items: backup scrubs, comfortable shoes, and a small photo of her late mother wearing her own nursing uniform from 1967. During quiet moments between patients, Margaret would find herself doing the same mental math she'd practiced for years. 12 more months. 12 more paychecks with their automatic payments flowing into her pension fund. The numbers felt as predictable as her morning routine, as certain as the rhythm of heart monitors in the cardiac wing. Her evenings followed their own gentle pattern. Grocery shopping on Wednesdays, never spending more than she'd budgeted, always choosing the store brand unless there was a real difference in quality. Friday nights meant dinner with her neighbor Sarah, two women in their late 50s who'd learned to appreciate quiet conversations over loud entertainment. On weekends, Margaret would tend to her small garden behind the house. Tomatoes, herbs, and the rose bush she'd planted the year she'd been promoted to charge nurse. She'd calculated once that the vegetables saved her about $40 a month in grocery costs, but that wasn't really why she grew them. There was something about watching things grow that reminded her of the patience required for most worthwhile things in life. The retirement magazines had started arriving 2 years ago, filled with glossy photos of couples walking on beaches and advice about maximizing compound interest in your golden years. Margaret would flip through them with the same gentle anticipation she brought to seed catalogs, imagining herself in those peaceful scenes, finally free to travel to places she'd only read about during brief breaks between patient rounds. Her financial life felt refreshingly simple. The same checking account she'd had for 15 years, the same credit union that had financed her car and her mortgage. She'd never needed to worry about complex investments or market fluctuations because her pension was handling all of that. Every month, she'd glance at the statement that arrived in her mailbox, note the steady growth, and file it away with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd played by the rules. The only time money caused her any stress was when she'd occasionally bump up against her credit limit during months when car repairs or home maintenance coincided with her annual vacation. But even those moments felt manageable, predictable challenges that could be solved with a few extra shifts or a temporary adjustment to her spending. What Margaret didn't realize was that her trust in systems had become so complete, so automatic, that she'd stopped asking the questions that might have protected her. She'd learned to read cardiac monitors with expert precision, but she'd never learned to read the warning signs hidden in financial statements that arrived with comforting regularity. The calm before the storm always feels like safety, right up until the moment it doesn't. The email arrived at 7:43 a.m. on a Tuesday that had started like any other. Margaret was finishing her coffee when her phone chimed with the notification that would split her life into before and after. "Dear plan participant," it began, and those first few sentences felt routine enough. Updates to administrative procedures, changes in contact information, the usual corporate language that she'd learned to skim through over the years. But then came the paragraph that made her hands start to shake. Due to significant investment losses and administrative mismanagement over the past 18 months, your current pension fund balance reflects a reduction of approximately 87% from previously reported values. The fund's portfolio, which had been invested in high-risk instruments without proper participant notification, suffered catastrophic losses during recent market volatility. Margaret read the sentence 3 times before the words began to make sense. 87%. The number sat there on the screen like a medical diagnosis she couldn't quite process. Where her statement had shown nearly $400,000 just 6 months ago, the current balance now read $52,000. The coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor in a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Her 401k rollover options, which she'd never needed to understand, were suddenly the only lifeline between her and working until she physically couldn't anymore. The email continued with bureaucratic apologies and explanations about regulatory investigations, but Margaret couldn't focus on the words anymore. All she could see was the math that no amount of nursing overtime could fix. $52,000. At 59 years old? 12 months from freedom that had just evaporated like morning fog. Her phone kept buzzing with text messages from colleagues who'd received the same devastating news, but Margaret couldn't bring herself to respond. The woman who spent her days managing other people's crises suddenly found herself drowning in one she'd never seen coming. For 3 hours, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, staring at the email that had rewritten her future. The broken coffee mug remained on the floor, its pieces scattered like the fragments of certainty she'd built her life around. The initial shock had given way to something quieter, more dangerous. Not panic, but a deep, hollow understanding that everything she'd believed about security had been an illusion. She'd spent 30 years trusting other people to protect her tomorrow, and now tomorrow had arrived wearing the face of a stranger. Her phone buzzed with calls from colleagues, friends who'd received the same devastating news. But Margaret couldn't bring herself to answer. What was there to say? That they'd all been naive? That trust had been their biggest mistake? Instead, she found herself reaching for a notebook she hadn't touched in years, the one where she'd once tracked every expense during her early nursing days when money was tight and dreams were fragile. Her handwriting looked foreign to her now, the careful calculations of someone who'd learned to count every dollar. The math was brutal but simple. $52,000. Maybe 10 years of living expenses if she was careful, if she stayed healthy, if nothing went wrong. The rollover IRA options mentioned in the email felt like foreign language, but she knew she'd have to learn that language quickly. As afternoon light filtered through her kitchen window, Margaret made a decision that surprised her. She wouldn't spend her remaining years fighting a legal battle she couldn't afford to win. She wouldn't let bitterness poison whatever time she had left. Instead, she would learn what she should have learned decades ago: how to save herself. Margaret's transformation began with a single phone call to her credit union, the first of many conversations that would teach her words she'd never needed to know: catch-up contributions, asset allocation, inflation risk. Each term felt like learning a new language, but Margaret approached it with the same methodical patience she'd brought to mastering cardiac care. She discovered that at 59, she could contribute an additional $7,000 annually to retirement accounts beyond the standard limits. It wasn't much, but it was something. More importantly, she learned that her remaining years in the workforce could still compound if she was strategic about where every dollar went. The hardest lesson came from understanding what she'd lost. Her pension fund hadn't just disappeared overnight. It had been slowly hemorrhaging value for months, while statements continued to arrive showing fictional numbers. The people she'd trusted had been either incompetent or dishonest, possibly both. But Margaret refused to let anger consume the energy she needed for rebuilding. Instead, she downloaded Personal Capital to track every dollar flowing in and out of her accounts with brutal clarity. For the first time in decades, she could see exactly where her money was going, where it had been, and where it needed to go next. The app showed her something surprising. Even with her reduced pension, she wasn't starting from zero. She had equity in her home, a modest but steady income, and most importantly, she had time. Not the comfortable cushion she'd planned on, but enough time to make different choices. Margaret began working extra shifts, not because she had to, but because she chose to. Each additional paycheck became ammunition in her battle against an uncertain future. She started researching side opportunities that could bridge the gap between her current reality and the retirement she still wanted to claim. The woman who had spent 30 years saving lives was finally learning to save herself. 6 months later, Margaret's life had found a new rhythm. The extra shifts she'd taken weren't draining her anymore. They were fuel for a future she was actively building rather than passively waiting for. Her personal capital dashboard showed steady progress, monthly contributions flowing into her rebuilt retirement accounts, a small but growing emergency fund, and most importantly, positive cash flow for the first time in years. She'd discovered something unexpected about starting over at 59. The skills that made her excellent at nursing, attention to detail, patience under pressure, the ability to stay calm during emergencies, translated perfectly to financial recovery. Every dollar was accounted for, every decision measured against her long-term goals. The side consulting work she'd started, helping train new nurses at smaller hospitals, brought in an extra $800 a month. It wasn't transformative money, but it was purposeful money, earnings that came from sharing knowledge she'd spent decades accumulating. Margaret's retirement timeline had shifted, but it hadn't disappeared. Instead of stopping work at 60, she now planned to transition gradually over 3 years, reducing her hospital hours while growing her consulting income. The compound interest she was finally earning on her catch-up contributions wouldn't make her wealthy, but it would make her secure. More importantly, she'd learned to read the statements, to ask the questions, to never again trust someone else with her future without understanding exactly what they were doing with it. The woman who had once trusted blindly now verified everything, and in that verification, she'd found a different kind of peace. Margaret still tends her garden on weekend mornings, but the woman kneeling among the tomato plants isn't quite the same person who once trusted tomorrow to take care of itself. She's learned that security isn't something you're promised, it's something you build, one careful decision at a time. The pension fund statement that shattered her world that Tuesday morning had contained a hidden gift wrapped in devastation. It forced her to discover strengths she didn't know she possessed, to master skills she'd never needed, to find courage in a chapter of life when most people assume the story is already written. Her retirement will look different than she'd once imagined. Maybe smaller, certainly later, but built on knowledge instead of faith, on choices instead of assumptions. The compound interest growing in her accounts might be modest, but it belongs to her in a way her old pension never did. Sometimes the most important lessons arrive disguised as disasters, teaching us that the person we trust most with our future should always be the one looking back at us in the mirror. Margaret learned that lesson at 59. The question isn't whether it's too late to start over. The question is whether you're brave enough to begin.